Welcome to all, it is a great pleasure. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our speaker today, Dr. Krishna Murthy Venkat Subramanian. He is the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. At 50 years of age, he is the youngest Chief Economic Advisor that India has had in its entire post-independence history. He is currently on leave from the Indian School of Business, where he is a professor of finance. He is a leading expert on economic policy, banking, and corporate governance. Dr. Subramanian has had all of his higher education in the top institutions of India and the United States. In India, he earned his bachelor's in engineering at IIT Kanpur and master's in business management at Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. In the United States, he earned his PhD from Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. Dr. Subramanian's scientific papers have appeared in most of the major finance journals, including the Review of Financial Studies, Journal of Financial Economics, and Journal of Financial and Quantitative Analysis. He has also co-authored 3 books. In his capacity as the Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. Subramanian has authored 3 economic surveys of the Government of India. You can see him gifting one of the economic surveys to the Prime Minister in the picture right behind him. The economic survey is, of course, the annual publication tabled in the Parliament a day before the presentation of the budget by the Finance Minister. And the budget presentation, of course, is a major event in India, unlike in the United States. In addition to presenting the survey of the economy in the preceding year, the economic survey offers economic policy ideas. Accordingly, in one of his 3 surveys, Dr. Subramanian has offered innovative ideas for ethical wealth creation. He advocates integrating India's rich economic and spiritual heritage with modern economic ideas through a marriage of the invisible hand of the market with the hand of trust. In an earlier 2019 economic survey, he outlined a strategic blueprint for India to become a $5 trillion economy. He suggested how private investment, growth, and consumption could be combined to generate a virtuous cycle. Before I conclude the introduction, I cannot resist mentioning that Dr. Subramanian's career is all the more impressive and remarkable for where it began. He is the very first member of his entire clan to have gone to college. His father had lost his own father at the age of 7 years and could not gather the means to go beyond school level education. He joined the railways as a clerk and saw to it that his children got the best education. So both of his boys eventually did their bachelor's degrees from prestigious IIT, Indian Institutes of Technology, and masters from equally prestigious Indian Institute of Management. Let me finally add that grapevine has it that Dr. Subramanian has Prime Minister Modi's ear. So today, hopefully, we'll get to hear ideas that are likely to be implemented in India in the forthcoming years. It is also a terrific opportunity for us to convince Dr. Subramanian of our ideas for India, since they can then find their way all the way to the top in the Indian administration. With this, it is my pleasure to invite Dr. Subramanian to enlighten us with his keynote address. He'll speak for about up to 30 minutes, after which we'll have a Q&A session. Dr. Subramanian.
Thank you very much, Arvind. Very good morning to all the students, faculty, and the eminent panel that has assembled here. Let me first start out by thanking Columbia University and the centers for inviting me to share my thoughts. It is indeed a genuine privilege to be addressing the students and the faculty at such a wonderful university. I'm going to focus a lot on what has been done over the last year and a half to 3 years, and give you a sense of the state of the economy, and talk about how steps that we've taken over the last 18 months in particular, how those shape India for future growth going forward. Let me start out by first mentioning that India has had a V-shaped recovery from the COVID-induced lockdown that led to a 24% decline in the first quarter of last year. Those of you who track my media interactions would have noted that at that time, when India had the steepest decline in GDP growth, I had predicted that there will be a V-shaped recovery at a time when possibly, with the exception of Dr. Panagaria, everybody else spelt or foretold, doom, economic doom for the country. At that time, we made this prediction, and I want to actually share with you first up what led to that. That prediction. What is that? Apart from the data that we very carefully track, my office tracks close to 60 high-frequency indicators on a weekly basis, and that is of course a very important aspect in being able to say things about the economy. But what is equally important is to also understand what was happening in the economy. I'm sure you would have heard a lot of commentary saying that India was slowing down even before the pandemic, and that the decline during the COVID pandemic was just an extension of that slowdown before the pandemic. I think it's apt for me to first address that particular narrative. The key point to actually remember here is, and a lot of commentary in this tries to attribute that the slowdown was because of the very important policy measures like demonetization and GST that were taken. I think when you look at the evidence, and there are now ample number of papers at top universities. Some of these are working papers, others published, which show that that narrative actually does not seem to hold together with the evidence. In fact, there's a paper by the current chief economist of the IMF, Geeta Gopinath, in the quarterly Journal of Economics, where they go and look at the impact on growth around the time of the demonetization and GST, both of which came together, and they don't find any impact on at the macro level, and therefore they go and look for evidence actually at the sectoral level. The important point that I want to actually mention here is that the slowdown in the Indian economy before the pandemic was primarily because of financial sector problems. I think a lot has been written on this, and all of you will be convinced that before 2014, there was a lot of crony lending that was done, in the Indian economy, a severe mismanagement of the banking sector. Those of you who have interests in watching these shows, there's a show in Netflix called Bad Billionaires, which focuses on some of these egregious cases of crony lending. There is also a book that's been written on that, I think, which gets into some of these aspects. Some people who actually now sort of in other countries, especially London, and I think are examples of this. So the important point here from an economic perspective that we must keep in mind is that unlike a crisis that starts in the real economy, a crisis that originates in the financial sector, the overhang from that is much longer. There's a lot of academic evidence actually in financial economics that shows that very clearly. But I think for our purposes, we can also look at the contrast between the global financial crisis versus the COVID crisis itself to understand this phenomenon. The global financial crisis, the impact of that, the overhang of that was very long, with actually many countries in Europe, suffering sovereign, debt problems because of problems that originated in the financial sector. In contrast, the COVID crisis last year, while global growth actually was at a historical low, this year global growth has bounced back to possibly being a historical high. And I think the same phenomenon, if you go and look at the crisis that had happened in 2001 in the United States, the tech crash that happened, again, the same phenomenon holds and contrasts with the global financial crisis. So the bottom line being from this, that whenever there is actually mucking around with the financial sector, the overhang that it creates is very long, because typically loans are 5 to 6 years long. And the bad loans that have been given, those come to roost, or those actually one becomes aware of only when those loans have actually come up for repayment and do not get repaid. Apart from that, when you add to that the incentives for evergreening and zombie lending, again, something that the financial economics literature has focused a lot on and has demonstrated, you see that this government actually in 2014 inherited a completely broken financial sector. The problems for which actually, created the overhang, those spilled onto the non-banking finance sector. And that is what led to the growth slowdown. And, there is robust evidence for this that we've pointed out. Those of you who are interested, I would encourage you to go and read the first chapter in volume 2 of the 2020 economic survey, 1920 economic survey. We had a specific section there analyzing the slowdown, appealing to many of these papers, distinguishing between a crisis that originates in the financial sector versus one that originates in the real sector, the impact of that on lending, thereby on investment, and finally on consumption growth, etc. So we actually showed that sequence of events, and so what I'm actually saying here is from that evidence. So bottom line, unlike a lot of commentary that seems to sort of convey that the policy moves, of demonetization or GST were the ones that were responsible for the slowdown, the evidence is very clear that it was the financial sector problems that actually led to the slowdown. And I think that was one of the key aspects that actually led us to, to sort of predict this V-shaped recovery, because we were very clear there was nothing wrong with the fundamentals of the economy, and that the impact on the on economy was primarily because of the restrictions that were placed on economic activities, as required by the COVID pandemic. And so once these restrictions were going to be removed, there should be a recovery, and that is exactly how it transpired. I think at least for those of us who've actually been in this side, it was not rocket science at all. So in fact, it was surprising for us to actually find so much commentary spelling gloom and doom for the economy, when we clearly saw that the fundamentals actually are strong. So that's the first point that I actually wanted to mention. And just in terms of the data, after the 24.4% decline in the first quarter, the second quarter was 7.5% decline, and then followed by 3 quarters of positive growth, which is actually something that very few countries have mustered during the pandemic. Q3, we had a 0.4% growth. Q4, we had a 1.6% growth. And these are all, by the way, year on year, and therefore, adjust for seasonality. And the first quarter of this year, we've had 20.1% growth, albeit from a lower base. And maybe, in the Q&A, we can talk about some of the nuances, of this, the first quarter growth. But I think the key point here I want to mention is, if you look at the third and fourth quarters, because there was a lot of subsidies that were given as part of the pandemic itself, it is better to look at the change in the gross value added. We all know macroeconomic identity, GDP is gross value added plus taxes minus subsidies. The GVA change was about 1.5% for the third quarter and close to 3% for the fourth quarter, which those are better estimates, which clearly suggested that the economy recovered very well. And if you plot these numbers on a graph, the graph looks like no other character but a V. And I think that is the first aspect that I wanted to mention. The second part, and here's actually I want to talk about the macro fundamentals the way they are, and why is it that the macro fundamentals are different, vis-a-vis 2 comparisons. I'm going to use two benchmarks as comparison. So let me first state that if you look at inflation in India, after going up a little bit during the second wave of the pandemic, and having been at 6.1% on average during the last year, a lot of which was because of the supply side frictions created by lockdowns, night curfews, etc. Inflation has now trended down to 4.5%, which is very comfortably within the range given to monetary policy of 2 to 6%. It's 4% plus minus 2%. So very comfortable. So inflation comfortable. Current account, we've had a surplus last year of 0.9%. There's a surplus in the first quarter as well. And the fiscal deficit, actually, we've managed the fiscal space much better than many peer economies, even though we got into this crisis with less fiscal room than other countries. Now, to illustrate and to explain why this is the case, I'm going to use two benchmarks for comparison. First, I'm going to contrast the policy response and the outcomes that were obtained after the global financial crisis in India. So that's going to be an India comparison. And second comparison I'm going to use is the contrast of India's macros vis-a-vis the rest of the world, and also I'm going to distinguish the important policy responses, the difference in the policy responses. But let me just lay out some of the data to start with. Let's take the comparison after the global financial crisis versus now. After the global financial crisis, inflation, without any supply side disruptions created by a lockdown or a night curfew, do remember that, because that is actually a counterfactual that we have to keep in mind. Without any of that, for close to 1.5 years, inflation was in double digits all through, every month double digits. That is what we had actually after the global financial crisis. On the fiscal side, while peer economies were at 2.5% in terms of their fiscal deficit, India was at 6.5%. So almost 2.5 times larger than peer economies. As for the current account, we were at 6%, close to 6%, 5.8% to be precise, current account deficit. So if you take the three most important, indicators that macroeconomists like to look at, which is inflation, fiscal deficit, and current account deficit, India was actually in the red on each one of those three metrics after the global financial crisis. No surprise, therefore, India was actually called part of the fragile five, and that is what led to the taper tantrum, the policy response, which I will actually talk about. Why is it that it's different? In contrast, now India actually, as I just mentioned, inflation has been in control, current account surplus, and fiscal deficit. Let me give you the numbers there. As part of COVID, every country has expanded the fiscal policy has been a very important part of the policy response. When you compare with peer economies, and I'm using data from the IMF Fiscal Monitor, India's fiscal deficit last year was 9.2%. The peer economies is 10.2%. So unlike after the global financial crisis, where we were 2.5 times our peer economies, we are now at 80% of the peer economies. Similarly, let me contrast with the with the global economy. The last issue of The Economist, the title of that was the shortage economy, and that is, there's a lot being written about supply side frictions that are biting in the global economy, whether it is commodity prices, whether it is shipment containers for exports. All of these are actually are being a problem. So on the one hand, if you look at India vis-a-vis the global financial crisis now versus other countries, the important distinction has been that while every other country has focused only on demand side measures, India is the only country that actually identified very early that the COVID pandemic is also one that will create enormous disruptions to the supply side. And especially an emerging country like ours, which does not have storage capacity. For instance, in the United States, food actually storage is very good, but we don't have that in India. And in the Indian context, almost 50% or half of the inflation, retail inflation, comes from food inflation. So when you have trucks that cannot ply in the night, whether it is vegetables, whether it's fruits, all of these will actually, there'll be far more wastage, and those supply side frictions actually would have created far more inflation. And as I mentioned, think about the counterfactual. If we had not identified that these are going to be supply side problems, and therefore we have to expand supply, the counterfactual would have been high double-digit inflation, which is what we had in the global financial crisis, without any of the lockdowns, without any of the night curfews. So the important distinction has been that India has actually focused on supply side measures, and I think this is Econ 101. If you only increase demand and you don't do anything to supply, then obviously price goes up. You do get a quantity side quantity push, but what happens is that if you have inflation, then the demand push that has been given by fiscal policy, eventually monetary policy will have to unwind that demand side push. And therefore, the impact that you get on growth is actually not as long lasting. In contrast, if you expand demand and you expand supply as well, aggregate demand and aggregate supply, then you actually don't get as much of an increase on the price side, which is inflation. You also get a much more robust response on the quantity side, GDP growth. Also, because if there is no increase in inflation, monetary policy does not have to unwind the push that has been given to demand by fiscal policy. As a result, when supply side measures are taken, keeping in mind that supply side measures, it's not as if you can flick on a switch and supply increases. Supply side increases take time. There's a gestation period, and so it's important to identify supply side frictions early and take measures along those lines, which is what India has done. So if you look at the currency, even look at the FDI and FPI inflows. After the global financial crisis, India had FPI outflows of $10 billion. In contrast, India has had now $36 billion inflows of FPI. FDI itself has been 10 times more compared to, and the currency depreciation around the global financial crisis was 58%, except for during the endogenous choice made in 1991, there has never been such a depreciation in the currency. In contrast, now the currency has held stable. All of these are indicative of the healthy macros that actually are because of the steps that have been taken. On this part, let me actually just say some more on the demand side, and then I'll talk about the reforms. On the demand side, India has actually been far more careful, far more prudent in taking demand side measures. Our demand side measures have been primarily twofold. One, on essential items, we've used in-kind transfers. We have a public distribution system, unlike in the United States, where checks have to be mailed to people, even if you want them to spend them on food and essential commodities. We here did it through the public distribution system. By far, possibly the largest free food. 800 million people were given free food, and are being given as part of the extended program now for close to a year and a half. Apart from that, cash transfers, were given to widows, were given to the women, because there's a lot of evidence again, which shows that women, spend the money far more wisely. Some of the research in microfinance and others that has shown that compared to giving loans to men, giving it to women actually leads to much better spending at the household level, and therefore the spending was done at the for women, cash transfers primarily to women. At the same time, other demand side push, you actually use the financial sector. The reason for that is very simple. When the FISC, tries to make a cash transfer or FISC oftentimes cannot identify very clearly who are the genuinely distressed and who are not genuinely distressed. In contrast, financial sector actually and financial institutions have better information because they have default history. And if a person defaults on the loan, there are both direct and indirect costs that come from that. It can affect your credit rating. As a result, what is typically adverse selection, and moral hazard in financial sector markets, when you top it up with a guarantee, credit guarantee from the sovereign, it can lead to favorable selection. I've written on this in an article in the Times of India. Those of you who are interested can read about this, the economic logic behind using loans given by the financial sector together with a credit guarantee. In sum, what this does is that it directs loans to only those that are genuinely distressed. In other words, those that have suffered both a liquidity shock and a credit shock, and thereby the loans end up. It's only those people who self-select into these loans, and therefore those that actually have suffered neither a liquidity shock nor a credit shock, people like us, we will not take those loans. And those that have suffered only a liquidity shock and not a credit shock, they will actually take that loan, but will repay because of the direct and indirect costs, that they would have to both bear if they actually defaulted on that loan. So that's a very simple idea there, thereby generating favorable selection. So, India's demand side measures, therefore, have used the leverage provided by the financial sector to limit the exact amount, that has to be, provided by the FISC, and also to target better. I'll just give you a contrast here using a personal anecdote. My daughter is studying at the University of Chicago. We all know it's a private university where actually only, unless you actually have a scholarship, typically, kids who can afford such education come in. Many of her friends, who are US citizens, have actually received checks from the, as part of the fiscal transfers, which actually illustrates to you. I think, it's very clear that these kids at some of these top universities certainly did not need fiscal transfers, as a result of the pandemic. I think that illustrates to you, the absence of careful targeting vis-a-vis, how India has done. So overall, I think, in terms of the policy response, India was very clear that we want to invest, in the demand side in a very careful manner, but at the same time also identify that the COVID pandemic is one that creates supply side disruptions, and therefore we have to actually take measures, enhancing supply at the outset, because it takes time to supply to pick up. And that then leads me to, to talk about the reforms, because the reforms are a very important part of these supply side measures, as is the capital expenditure that has been, put in the budget. Many of you might have read about these reforms. If you look at the reforms, whether it's the labor market reforms, the farm bill, the recent telecom reforms, the retrospective taxation, the change in the corporate tax rate, lowering it to, bringing it down to 15%, which happened before, the move towards privatization, which is part of a policy focused on, an enterprise policy focused on the private sector, which essentially recognizes that government has no business being in business except for 3 or 4 strategic sectors. So, when you put all these together, I would club them as factor market reforms that are really intended to bring more competition into the factor markets. And I think those are extremely important if we have to actually push, competitiveness in manufacturing. Let me characterize what we saw as some of the problems in the manufacturing side. Many of us learn in economics that production is actually labor, capital, other raw material inputs and other inputs, and total factor productivity. If we use that prism, there are 5 problems that, in my opinion, Indian manufacturing firms and in general Indian manufacturing sector suffers from. And many of these reforms are actually intended to address those. First, if you take, power is a very important input for manufacturing firms, and power costs have been actually higher than than other countries. Logistics costs, the product that is manufactured has to be shipped to to the coast so that they actually can be exported, or even within the country itself. Logistics costs, those have actually been higher compared to other countries. That's the second. These are all part of the cost of production. Labor costs, and actually labor, because our labor regulation has been very stringent, and Dr. Purnagire has actually written very eloquently on this, that has been a problem. Apart from that, if you take capital, which actually I just spoke about the financial sector, the problems that we had in the financial sector, which also meant that the average firm had to pay a very high cost of capital. That's the other important point. Finally, there are 2 other aspects that are actually you can club them as part of total factor productivity, which is the optimal scale that the firm should be in, because economies of scale is one key aspect that really reduces the cost of production by reducing the total cost, taking the total cost over a larger denominator and thereby reducing average costs. And finally, whether the production should be in the public sector or in the private sector, because these impact actually the efficiency of use of those assets and therefore total factor productivity. Now, if you start seeing labor reforms are intended to actually reduce the effective cost of labor, the capital expenditure 35% increase this year, announced in the budget, and primarily focused on transportation, on logistics, and on power. And the Gati Shakti program that has been announced by the Prime Minister recently is part of the logistics cost. So infrastructure, actually the entire national infrastructure pipeline is focused on these 2 areas, logistics and power. So 2 key inputs into manufacturing. The enterprise policy focused on the private sector is really intended to actually improve efficiency by transferring assets to the private sector. We economists actually acknowledge that when private sector works in areas that where there are no market failures, you have incentives and information working for the economy rather than against the economy. And that is and finally, a problem that India has had, and again, this is an area that Dr. Panagiri has actually written very well on, is that this phenomenon of dwarfism in India. There's a very nice paper by Pete Glenau and other researchers at Harvard in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which actually shows that if you plot on the x-axis the age of a firm in the economy, and on the y-axis you plot the number of jobs that the average firm creates at different ages as a multiple of the number of jobs that it created when it was 5-year-old. So in other words, let's say both in the US and in India, a firm generates 100 jobs when it's 5-year-old. The question then is basically how many jobs does it generate when it's 10 years old as a multiple, 120, 140, whatever it is, and then go on as the firm ages. The fact here is, if you look at the United States, when a firm is 30-year-old, that firm produces 700 jobs. If it generated 500 jobs, when it was 5-year-old, if it generated 100 jobs when it was 5-year-old, it generates 700 jobs when it's 30-year-old. The same ratio for India is only 140. In other words, a firm that generated 100 jobs when it was 5-year-old generates only 140 jobs when it's 30-year-old. This is the phenomenon of dwarfism. These firms age, but they don't grow. And that is because of the perverse incentives that have been provided, whether it's labor laws and many other aspects. And so the change in the MSME definitions and the production-linked incentives that have been brought in are actually to give incentives for growth and thereby really avoid the problem of dwarfism and encourage firms thereby to actually get closer to the optimal scale and reduce, and reduce costs by benefiting from economies of scale. So these are all primarily intended to really push, manufacturing growth, because that's the area that can create organized sector jobs and for our youth, which is very important for inclusive growth. So when you take all these, together, and that would be my concluding part of, what I'm going to speak about, is given these reforms going forward at the macroeconomic level, we expect, two things to happen. One is the investment rate to go up. And second is the incremental capital output ratio to change as well, which is basically just jargon, economic jargon for efficiency of use of the assets in the economy. And some of our internal projections, we actually have projected that under various scenarios, given these reforms, there will be changes in the investment rate and the incremental capital output ratio. As a result, we can expect India to have a 7% growth on average, in this decade. And our projection for this year itself is that we will have growth of 10% plus this year. Next year, we're expecting, I'm talking about FY23, growth between 6.5% to 7%. But as the impact of these reforms starts manifesting, with the lag that is inevitable in such kind of reforms, you will start seeing growth rates accelerating further, both through investment rates going up and through the productivity. And here, in the investment rate going up, the infrastructure spending that the government is doing is actually a very important aspect. As we had shown in this year's economic survey, on the chapter on fiscal policy, unlike typically the way it's thought that government spending crowds out private investment, in the Indian context, especially at a time like the COVID pandemic, when the private sector, because of risk aversion, will not invest, government spending on capital expenditure, and over the last 20 years, the evidence is true as well, crowds in private investment. And therefore, infrastructure is very important in fostering the investment rate by the private sector. So overall, when you put all these together, I would conclude by saying that to use a parallel, the 100 billion, the 100 crore doses that we've done, which of vaccination, is sort of the trailer for the movie that has started. As the movie unfolds, a lot of those who actually had contrarian views will slowly but surely start seeing and will start seeing what the movie is really going to show. So overall, this decade, I expect, given the seminal reforms that have been done and the change in the investment policy focused on capital expenditures, India should actually experience high growth and a growth that will be inclusive through job creation in the manufacturing sector. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for giving me a patient hearing. I'd be very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Subbu, for that wonderful, wonderful rendition. You covered a lot of territory. So we have limited time. So rather than give my own commentary at this point, let me invite Jan to give his remarks, and then we will open it up to Q&A. There are quite a few questions that have come up as well. So Jan.
Thank you, Arvind. Dr. Subramanian, this was a terrific presentation, cogently presented and very informative. I think.
Jan, speak a little louder.
A little louder. Okay, I'll speak a little bit louder. I have a little bit of a problem with my microphone here, it seems. So, and again, very cogently argued, very informative. I think that the description of the macro fundamentals, how you went through the recession, and the fact that you correctly predicted the V-shaped recovery, very good. The rapid growth that has ensued, the fact that you focus on the supply side measures and had the accompanying demand side adjustments and the reforms. I'm really very impressed by the reforms that have been undertaken as a long-term observer and student of developing economies in India. This is really terrific. So let me pose the question, maybe sort of looking forward. You are, I think, correctly predicting, the major gains that will still come from everything that has been started. What about the global situation? We're now observing that the growth has been slowing down in the United States, in Germany. Last month, industrial production actually contracted. Are you worried that that might actually have deleterious effects? And if so, is the Indian economy strong enough that actually the positive effects that you've outlined so clearly will prevail?
I think that's an excellent question, Jan. There is no denying that India now, as globally linked as it is to the rest of the world, there will be some effects of a slowdown in global growth, no doubt about that. But if I would just take, let's say, the macroeconomic identity in terms of GDP being consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus net exports. I think, if you, and I'm just using some ballpark estimates, about 60% of, the GDP comes from consumption in India, close to, I would say, 30%, on average is from investment, and, net exports are sort of, they, sort of balance out, and leaving about 9 to 10% for government on average. So I think first up, that tells me that the Indian economy is large enough, and I think here especially the measures that we've taken, which is to really take into account the fact that we have a very large consumer base in terms of the population. What has been lacking there actually is the disposable income. And if we go by the permanent income hypothesis that Milton Friedman put out, there is nothing better than a job in the organized sector to actually change consumption, because it's only when there is a change in permanent income and expectation of permanent income will consumption change. And I think a job actually does that. So if we have to increase aggregate demand in the economy, especially by increasing consumption at the, at not just the top 25-30% of the income pyramid, but also, in the remaining 70% of the income pyramid, jobs are extremely important. And that has been a point of emphasis, as I've just said, the manufacturing sector, sector growth, that is quite important. So the measures that we have taken are intended to actually really benefit the, the Indian economy. And I'll draw a parallel. I know one of the aspects that has inspired us is the New Deal under President Roosevelt. The decade that I spent in the United States, I remember, that towns like Detroit, for instance, were actually built, and they acquired their sort of, they became, came to their pomp because of the manufacturing sector jobs that were created when large sections of people were transported into the middle class. a phenomenon that has to happen in India as well. I think that is something that we are emphasizing, which will thereby increase the portion of growth that comes from the Indian economy itself. But that's a long-term phenomenon. Your question clearly was focused on the short term. I think there will be some impact of that, especially on the exports. But I think it'll be important for us to push on some of the other policy measures. And again, here Dr. Panagaria has written very well to ensure that that we can still accelerate our exports. Even if you take as a proportion of global exports, we are still at such a small percentage that even if, let's say, global economy is going down, just through the intrinsic margins, right, we can really grow. What you're talking about is the extrinsic margin, I think, but there is enough scope in the intrinsic margin itself, for us to grow on those dimensions.
Makes sense. Thank you very much, Arvind.
Thank you, Jan. Thanks. Thanks very much. Okay, so just going along very much the lines that you're saying, I should mention that this is open, so what you're saying is public. Now, on exports and trade, when you mentioned, that's one area where the policy seems to have been a bit on the weak side. India has kind of raised tariffs in the last 5-6 years. That's clearly, I think, probably the only area where I have actually felt that the policy seems to have gone in the wrong direction. And really, it seems to me that if one wants to maximize the impact of all the good reforms that have been done, of which there are many, trade is so very important. So if you can really comment on that, feel free not to comment if that's what you want to do.
No, thanks a lot, Arvind. I think that's an important question. Arvind, you would recall that in the 2020 economic survey, I'd written a chapter, about where the chapter was titled "Make in India for the World," and where I had clearly highlighted that if we look at the pattern that has prevailed in exports, and you of course the expert in this area, but so pardon my impertinence in actually saying this, not as a specialist in this area, but my own reading of the literature as well has highlighted that a lot of countries have typically started with assembly and then moved on to and using, and especially for a country like India, it is important to really utilize our advantage on the labor side, so I think we need to be comfortable with the idea that we can actually assemble. And if you take the Indian example itself, if you take the automobile sector, Maruti Suzuki, actually, we were importing components. It was basically being assembled in India in the 1960s and 70s. And then, it started with assembly, but then the ancillary sector actually grew. And then, the value chain saw the supply chain expanded. So I think this is a phenomenon that is important. I would say that and again, this is something that we all recognize, that it is important to make our firms competitive. Oftentimes a lot of these trends happen, when the domestic sector, domestic firms are intrinsically not as competitive. And I think in that, especially on the manufacturing side, the many steps that we've taken, whether it's actually on the inputs, which is power, logistics, labor reforms, the change in the MSME definitions to sort of enable more scale, the production-linked incentives, all these are intended to enhance the competitiveness of our firms. It's only when their costs are lower that they can actually price themselves well in the global market, at the same time also be able to compete well, with competitors in the domestic market. So I think, in that sense, in terms of sequencing, having taken many of these measures, I think, we're in a good position in terms of the sequencing to be able to actually take measures along the lines that you're suggesting as well.
Thanks, Subbu. Now, I have too many questions here from the audience. So there's going to be a bit of a challenge. Let's see how far, I'll try to, maybe if we can move a little fast. So the first question that came from Lopa Banerjee, how much of the growth in GDP of 20.1% in the first quarter was attributed to domestic consumption, private investment, government spending, and trade balance? Is the export target of 400 billion for FY22 rather modest, given that already 33 to $34 billion monthly exports are met continuously since April?
Yeah, I think Lopa, I think you've answered the question, second part of your question. Given the 33 odd billion dollars per month, I think we should be able to meet that target. As for the the breakup of the GDP numbers for the first quarter, let me sort of add to your question and say one of the things that has been looking up is the investment rate. As a percentage of GDP, the gross fixed capital formation has been around 32-33% since the third and fourth quarter of last year, and this year as well. And as I'd mentioned, it's an explicit policy push by and that was announced in the budget as well for government capex. So a large contribution to this also came from capex. So overall, if you take the split, I think that broad ballpark that I mentioned, between 58 to 60% for consumption, investment close to 33%, government spending about 10% or so. I think that would hold good in terms of the split.
Thanks. Okay, so the next question is from Priyesh Tiwari. He says, would the economic recovery of India anytime in future surpass that of China in terms of any indicators?
So I think, I would say this decade, we are likely to be, certainly among the fastest growing economies in the world. And I think that I would say in comparison to any country that you take as a benchmark.
Okay. The third question, next one, is on demonetization, and the questioner, we don't have the name here, says that demonetization hasn't achieved its intended purpose. One sees black money coexist fully within the economy. In fact, demonetization seems to have really affected small businesses.
So the way I would actually take this is that, yes, demonetization together with GST did have an impact on some of the less efficient firms in the economy. If you think statistically, there is a distribution of firms, not necessarily a bell curve, but there is a distribution where, the most productive or most efficient firms are on the right tail and less efficient firms on the, on the left tail. And any push towards formalization, greater formalization of the economy typically does have an impact on the less efficient firms. But I think this is part of the push towards formalization. If we really have to actually expand the tax base, to be able to do, much better, in terms of the building of infrastructure, being able to take care of some of the welfare, programs and measures, etc. Formalization is something that is very important. And, if you look at the very high rate of digitization that has happened since demonetization, and it started with demonetization and has been accelerated by the pandemic. I think, counterfactually, I would say, if we did not have demonetization, that initial push towards digitization would not have happened. It's possible that the pandemic might have started it, but India got a lead on digitization and thereby formalization of the economy through the combination of both demonetization and GST. And I think that is something we have to do. As economists, we always recognize that there is we're all two-handed. There is costs and benefits, and measures that create some short-term costs but long-term benefits are desirable than those that create short-term benefits and long-term costs.
Okay, your next one comes from Willem Bouter. Before COVID, investment as a share of GDP in India was in the low 30%. Since the recovery from COVID, investment as a share of GDP is more volatile, but appears to track somewhere just below 30%. What measures have been taken or are being considered to boost private and public investment in India?
I think I already, alluded to these in my remarks. These several measures that we've taken on the supply side, including the corporate tax rate cut, several of the reform measures, the capital expenditures, especially focused on infrastructure. All these will really help in, in pushing investment. One aspect that I did not have time to cover, but I think which is very salient, which I must mention, is the digital infrastructure that India, has created. Whether it is the JAM Trinity, what is called the Jan Dhan. Jan Dhan is actually financial inclusion accounts, 400 million accounts, and the balances there are actually non-trivial now. The Aadhaar, which is the digital identity, and the mobile. So the JAM Trinity, what is called the account aggregator, which actually is a way for consumers to be able to provide their information, for all the transactions that they do, while maintaining privacy. The account aggregator, the UPI, which is actually a very important innovation that India has done, together with e-rupee. And when you put all these together, the important distinction is that India has created all these, this digital infrastructure as public goods. And again, those of you who actually would learn in your economics classes that public goods are typically under-provided or under-provisioned by the private sector. And even when they are provided by the private sector, you can have monopolies and therefore monopoly pricing, which then leads to lower access. In contrast, when they're provided by the public sector, you actually have, closer to optimal provision and, pricing that is actually that enables, closer to optimal access. And this is where India has been different from the United States or many other economies in really laying out this digital infrastructure, which will, enhance credit and thereby also investment, especially for the small and medium enterprises. Because historically, if we see over the last 2-3 decades, as a percentage of GDP or as a percentage of the overall balance sheet of the banking sector, credit that has gone to the small and medium enterprises has not picked up as much. And that, I think, this data infrastructure is something that will really help in that process. So all these steps will really help in accelerating credit and thereby investment as well going forward.
Okay, I think we are fighting against time here. I still have a very long list here. I don't know, Jan or David, can we go a little bit longer? And of course, Subbu, you too, if you have the time.
Sure, I have this.
Yes, we can go till 10:15 as far as I'm concerned, Arvind.
Okay, is that all right, Jan? Okay, good. So that helps a little bit. Okay, guys, stop giving more questions now. There is no way. It's still, after answering half dozen questions, we still have 23 open questions. So it's going to be a bit of a race. I may have to be a little more selective now. Okay. Well, this one you can answer quickly. Is India growing despite the government?
I think the previous answer that I just gave you, on creation of the digital infrastructure as public goods answers that.
Okay, good. All right. If not for pandemic, what would the shape of the economy be? In January, March 2020 quarter, the GDP grew at 3.1%. How did the finance ministry think of recovery if the world had no COVID? That's a good one.
That's a good question. Part of it, I think I covered in the first part of my remarks. Do keep in mind that the last quarter of 2000, so this is, I'm talking about March 2020, the pandemic started hitting, in India early March. If you track the Google mobility indicators, those show compared to the Jan-Feb levels, March, the mobility indicators were down about 15-20%. And March, because that's close to the financial year, is a very important part. So what you're seeing as 3.1% is actually affected by the pandemic itself, the first month of the pandemic. So keep that in mind, number one. Number two, as I mentioned, the slowdown, and I think I speak based on evidence, as I've done on all through in the last 3 years, the slowdown before the pandemic was primarily because of the financial sector. I think there's a lot been written about the crony lending and the gross mismanagement of the banking sector that happened until 2014. And the fact that the overhang when problems are created in the financial sector, that overhang is very, very long. So that is what really affected, created the slowdown. As for, I think in terms of if COVID had not happened, it would be fair to say that India reforms well, when faced with a crisis. So it would, I think that sort of, I'm giving you a hypothetical scenario. Maybe the urgency for many of these reforms, some of those may possibly not have happened. That's just speculation. So a lot of the post-COVID economy, the growth that we'll see will definitely be enabled by these reforms. I think while we might have possibly fixed the financial sector because the problems are definitely glaring, but some of the other aspects that is actually that have frictions in the in the real economy, especially on the supply side, those possibly might not have gotten addressed, in which case we may have had to sort of settle down for lower growth because of the presence of some of those frictions. So I think when you look at the Indian economy post COVID, you have to take into account the fact that we've converted that crisis into an opportunity as well.
Perfect. Very good point. Very good point. So in your economic survey, you have somewhere alluded to inherent bias in the way the sovereign credit rating agencies rate India. What is that rating agencies? What is it that the ratings agencies are missing, which they ought to pay attention to?
Yeah, that's I could give a seminar, 1.5-hour seminar on that with all the slides. So let me crash it to 15 seconds then. No, I think I'll just refer to one chart in the first chart in that chapter. If you just track the rating of the 5th largest economy in the world, and that was the first chart. So different countries start, Italy, China, and many other countries. I think Germany, UK, other countries. So this 5th largest economy in the world, that position has been occupied by many different countries over the last 20-25 years. The first chart we plot there is, it is the first time in history that the 5th largest economy is rated BBB. And let me say it very clearly here, given that the rating agencies are based in New York. The empirical model that the rating agencies use, it's an empirical model. Let's be very clear. It uses GDP per capita as a very important determinant of credit ratings, which actually that fit the data very well before the global financial crisis. But after the global financial crisis, you've had countries like Ireland, Greece, and others with high GDP per capita, which actually have had sovereign debt problems. And yet that empirical model is something that continues. Conceptually, when you think about it, and I say this actually as a financial economist, the overall debt that the country has, it is the GDP that is used to repay that debt. If I take on, let's say, $100 billion of debt, it's the overall output GDP and, both private sector, public sector combined, it's GDP that is actually used. And that's why we look at debt to GDP as a ratio. It's not GDP per capita. It's empirically has fit the data well before the crisis, but I think it is absolutely time now that those models are actually really looked at. And I think conceptual grounding is provided to these models. I don't see GDP per capita, as really a very good conceptual metric for determining sovereign ratings. And let's also face the data. If you look at the correlation between ratings and actual defaults for firms versus that for the sovereign ratings, you see that the fit with sovereign ratings is very, very is much poorer compared to what you see for the for the firms. And I think there you have, in terms of the evidence itself, what needs to be corrected.
Yes, I think very true. In fact, if you look back, India has never defaulted, and it'll never do so, because 1991 balance of payments crisis, India went so far as to fly gold from the Reserve Bank of India to London so that it would not have to default. So,
And,
so
and I think, Arvind, because you've raised a very important point, let me add to this as well. Many countries, and especially many of the Latin American economies, have defaulted.
Yes.
For India, and actually I have observed this, Arvind has observed this as well. For us, defaulting on a loan is not an economic aspect. It actually is, there is bipartisan support that for us, it is actually much deeper than that. Two aspects of India actually, which is that we've never ever gone and attacked any country on our own, and we've never defaulted on our obligations. That is something that actually stems from something much deeper, about India. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, Arvind.
Thanks. Okay, so next one, I think you've already answered in many different ways. This question is about apart from being consumption-based economy, does India have a roadmap for improving exports and alleviating its balance of payment situation? So you have answered that, so we'll take that as answered. Okay, the next one says, my question is, what steps have been taken by the government of India to manage against future disastrous consequential tail risks events like COVID, obviously, which is extremely important for the existence of historical development in the economies globally at large? Okay. How prepared was India for the same earlier?
Yeah.
And he also wants to thank you for your great presentation. So,
thank you. That's a very good question. So I think the pandemic has clearly highlighted the need for focus on health infrastructure. And this year's economic survey, we had a chapter outlining all the steps that have to be taken. And the budget this year actually has built in 135% increase in the overall healthcare spending, both on the prevention side and on the cure side. As Benjamin Franklin remarked in 1736, an ounce of prevention is actually much better than a pound of cure. And I think India has actually really implemented that, in focusing on a lot of preventive aspects. For instance, drinking water. The Jal Shakti mission is a very important part of that. Similarly, the Swachh Bharat campaign, which actually has really, and I've shown evidence, very careful evidence in the 2019 economic survey, showing that malaria deaths, diarrhea deaths, actually in a causal manner have really improved because of the cleanliness campaign that was launched. So and recently, and those of you who track India would have noted that the Honorable Prime Minister launched the digital Ayushman Bharat mission. And let me just mention that we had covered the benefit that has accrued from the insurance, the insurance part of Ayushman Bharat. Those states in India that have implemented the insurance program have really benefited in terms of health outcomes. And I think the digital version of that will accelerate it further. So I think the COVID pandemic has really highlighted, and India has responded to that by really investing in health infrastructure. And I think going forward with the use of telemedicine, digital technologies, etc., I'm sure we will be able to actually provide much better access to to our close to 1.3 billion people.
So here is a both interesting and tough one. How important is Modi and his team for keeping India on this new trajectory? What is the outlook if BJP doesn't get another term? So it's a political question. You can.
Yeah, no, I'll answer that. Having had the privilege of interacting with the Honorable Prime Minister, very closely, and I said this in a recent statement that I gave as well. There are 2 or 3 things that stand out for me. In a democracy, it is very easy to succumb to populism. And I actually can tell you, and I say this with confidence, that he's someone who actually does not, always succumb to populism. And I think if you just take the recent example over the last year or so, or maybe 6 months, there's been a lot of, a push on petrol and diesel prices, for instance. But I think, that's where, India has actually done the right thing. So I see, the ability to resist populism, which I actually, categorize as moves that may give you some short-term gains, but create a lot of long-term costs. And as I was mentioning earlier, when you take policy measures, those that may create some short-term costs, but a lot of long-term gains always are preferable to those that create, short-term gains and a lot of long-term costs. And I actually have seen, that courage of conviction in him to be taking the difficult decisions. For instance, the lockdown, and I, having been part of the interactions, I can tell you that we recognize very well that, either which way, whether we do a lockdown or we don't do a lockdown, there will be, criticism. And that's part of being a policymaker, because, most people do not look at the counterfactual of what if. In other words, if we had not done the lockdown, we would have said, oh, you should have done the lockdown. And if we did the lockdown, we shouldn't have done the lockdown. That is, par for the course for a policymaker. But I think that courage of conviction to be able to take difficult decisions and actually follow through with it is something that India really needs. I've said that, and I actually have, as someone who has had the opportunity to observe his leadership, I think India really needs his leadership, in decisive leadership in being able to take, difficult decisions. We certainly cannot afford to go back to that 10-year period when, when there was basically, paralysis in decision making and a lot of corruption, actually a corruption of the order that India has never seen. We certainly cannot afford to go back to that in the last decade.
There's an interesting article coming out from Swami Iyer, which also says that, India used, this is Len Pritchard's terminology, that India is not a failing state, but it's a flailing state. And he says that India is no longer can you say that India is a flailing state. And he really gives a number of examples of how governance has improved so dramatically in the last 10 years that a lot of the things that could not be imagined have been actually done. Like Swachh Bharat, for example, going from just 38% toilets to, it may not be 100%, but 75 to 80%, that itself is, financial inclusion, etc., all of that. So the governance clearly has done very well, has improved.
In fact, let me add to this just very quickly, short.
Please.
I think on welfare programs itself and the administration of welfare programs, efficiently, removing inclusion and exclusion errors. And I think that is something that this government has done very well, whether it's the Swachh Bharat campaign, the PM Awas Yojana, which is building houses. Many of these, I think there's been clear improvement. And now there is actually a very cogent vision for the economy as well. And I think that is something, I will mention the Honorable Prime Minister in his speech in the budget session of Parliament, commended that India needs to respect, wealth and wealth creators. And I think that the Hindu Business Line the next day carried a lead editorial saying that this was a watershed moment, because none other than the Prime Minister actually talking about, ethical capitalism, in the floor of Parliament. I think these are very, very important aspects going forward for India.
Okay, so I think, we'll take one more question, last one. I'm sorry, I still have about 27 open questions here. So you've been extremely popular, as you can see, but it's a losing battle for me not to be able to take more. And we have already taken more time than we had hoped for. So I'll take this last one. This question concerns inequality. It's something about which very little policy can do, really very limited. Nevertheless, it is a question which comes all the time in the popular discourse. So perhaps we should take your reaction on this. So the way the question reads is that it is most likely that the COVID has resulted in widening the inequalities in India, since the pandemic has impacted the poor more due to loss of jobs and lack of adequate cash transfers. Similarly, the SME sector has been impacted more than the large companies due to the pandemic. The policy announcements like PLI, etc., will largely benefit the larger companies and widen the gap. So there's no question, but if we can take your comment on that.
Yeah, no, I think I would add more nuance to this on a couple of dimensions. I would, whoever has asked this question, I would request you to refer to this
Derek Diaz.
Derek, please go and refer to this chapter that we wrote in this year's economic survey. It was titled Inequality versus Growth, conflict or convergence. And, we actually took up this issue and dealt with it in detail. I think, the answer in some sense is in your question itself. The fact that, we had a year of minus 7.4% growth, minus 7.5% growth. And as a result, inequalities actually may have increased. Is I think illustrative of the enormous impact of growth. I think since 1991, because of the very high growth that we've had, we've actually really been able to reduce inequality significantly. And I say this because, when we get growth, a lot of commentators start saying, oh, growth is fine, but what about inequality? I think it is really important for us to really remember that growth is far more important for people at the bottom of the pyramid. If anybody tells you that growth and inequality are in conflict, remind them about exactly what we mentioned in your question about the pandemic year, when we actually had a decline in growth, a negative growth, and inequality got exacerbated. I think that is sort of an anecdotal example of why growth is so important for reducing inequality itself. Now, and this is my second observation, I think, and I did mention as part, inclusive growth. There is nothing better than a job in an organized sector for actually, really bringing both social and economic inclusion of not just the individual, but the entire family. I know this personally myself, actually. When one person gets a job in the organized sector, my dad worked with the railways, and he was able to educate us. And I think both anecdotally and economic research clearly shows that jobs in the organized sector are really important for reducing inequality in society. As for the small enterprises, etc., clearly in the measures that I talked about, a lot of those are intended primarily for the small firms. If you look at the credit guarantee scheme that was launched, close to 4.5 lakh crores, so 4.5 trillion rupees of credit has been given, and that has been focused exclusively on the small and medium enterprises. So I think, let me conclude by saying, and this is something I tell my students often, the difference between good and bad thinking is all about a play of 3 A's. Aggregates and averages typically help in good thinking. Anecdotes oftentimes can lead to bad thinking. So let's just be very careful when we interpret from anecdotes and instead rely on aggregates and averages. And I think if you look at the credit scheme, I think in aggregate, I think you will find that there has been a lot done for the small and medium enterprises itself.
Thank you, Subbu. So I think we'll sort of end the Q&A section here. This was fantastic. Thanks for indulging us. I think, we took a lot longer of your time than originally agreed. Pankaj is going to give the vote of thanks. Pankaj is a student in our policy management, economic policy management program. So Pankaj.
Thanks, Professor Pangaria. Dr. Subramaniam, as always, really wonderful to listen to your views. Always a pleasure to read your articles, your work about Indian economy, global economy in general. So my sincere thanks to you for joining us today for this very insightful discussion. Professor Pangaria, Jan, you have been a great support. Thank you so much for being part of the panel. And my special thanks to all those in audience today who participated. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And the measure of success is that you still have 27 outstanding questions, and you've not lost your audience.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Subbu. Bye-bye.